right, thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I thank you for your time. Thank you for just sitting down with me. And thank you for your support of this ministry. As you know, The Gospel Truth is engaging the culture of Christian truth. And we do that through debate, interviews, and Bible lessons. And today I have an interview for you. As you know, I had Eddie Caparucci on, and he came on and we talked about overcoming porn addiction. And now we're going to discuss with Marnie Faree. We're going to be talking about overcoming sexual assault, overcoming if somebody is sexually abused, overcoming these issues. We're not going to just do it in a more therapeutic nature, but we also want to do it inside the church. Like, we want to talk about overcome these issues inside the church as well. But before I bring her in, I do want to go over a couple of announcements that I have coming up. Let me pull this up real quick. All right, I have coming up February 25th, I have Dr. Vince Bantu, and he's going to be coming on. We're going to be discussing, is Christianity the white man's religion? In today's culture, we have a lot of flack that's flying over to Christendom, if you will, about this kind of stuff. But we're going to discuss this issue within a black community. Is Christianity white man's religion? So I suspect that will be a fantastic interview, a very informative interview. Coming up February 28th, I have Dil de Parizas, I think I pronounced his name right, King James Version onlyist, and versus Timothy Berg, a former KJV onlyist, and they're debating, should the King James Version rendering of Acts 8:32 be in the text of the Bible? That's coming up February 28th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Next up, I have another debate. OG Giwa Amu, I think I pronounced that right, Unitarian, and Cordy Olawanyin. These names, I'm sure they'll correct me when they come on. That'll be debate, and the topic is Jesus equal to the Father? February 29th, 2020, and this one will be out of the U.S., so I'll be having a showtime start at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Over in the U.K., it'll be 8 p.m., and over in Nigeria, it'll be 9 p.m., so make sure you hit that time right. I know everyone's used to me starting at 6 p.m., but this one will be at 12 p.m., so keep your calendars marked for that one. And finally, March 2nd. Now, there's a debate, participant change. Carl Desmond will not be the participant there. I have the person. I'm just making the promotional for it, but the person that's debating, he has a very difficult name, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that name, but he's a Hebrew Israelite, and they'll be debating, are black Christians, are they Christians, or are they Israelites? Another term to mark Israelites, are they Israelites? So that should be an interesting one. This is probably a first for this show. And that's coming on March 2nd, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That is the next 4 shows, but there are a whole bunch of shows. I have a whole slew of shows that are coming up, interviews and debates that are coming up. And so if you go over to the YouTube page and the Facebook page, make sure you like and follow there and subscribe and hit the notification bells. So you'll be up to par on all the shows that are coming up. All right. Once again, this is just 4 shows. If you want the update of all the shows I have, flow over to the YouTube page. Also, all this content is on podcast. So I'm on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, all the major platforms for podcasts. So go ahead, head over there and subscribe there. But with that said, let me introduce my guest. Marnie Faree is a licensed marriage and family therapist in Nashville, Tennessee, where she is the founder and director of Bethesda Workshops, a faith-based clinical intensive workshop program for sex addicts, their partners, and couples affected by sexual addiction. The workshop program she established in 1997 for female sex addicts was the first of its kind in the country. Her book, No Stones, Women Redeemed from Sexual Addiction, was the first to address the sexual addiction in women from a Christian perspective. She is also the volume editor and contributing author of Making Advances, a comprehensive guide for treating female sex and love addicts, which is the first clinical book on this topic. Marnie is the author of a workbook for female sex addicts, clinical articles in peer-reviewed journals, and numerous inspirational articles. She is certified sex addiction therapist through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. And she served for over a dozen years on the editorial board of Sex Addiction and Compulsivity Journal. Marnie is a frequent speaker at professional and recovery conferences churches and schools and has been featured on Dateline and other media. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Marlon. I'm glad to be here. Sounds like you've got interesting shows.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm just excited. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about what's going on, because like I told you, the whole idea is to engage the culture of Christian truth and make sure that not only are people, viewing for, I guess, a quote unquote entertainment value, but they're actually learning something, that they're actually taking in something to grow their Christian faith. And I find that very important. And that's why I brought you on, because this subject matter of overcoming sexual abuse or overcoming sexual addiction, these topics seem at times that they don't get as much exposure as they should. And this is one of the things that are plaguing the church, that are plaguing areas in society. And it's almost like swept under the rug, and one of those things, almost like a taboo conversation, like, oh yeah, we don't talk about
Right.
that stuff. So that's why I wanted to invite you on, and so we can, so we could talk about it a little bit. So I do want to start off. If you have to, if you're able, can you tell me like your story, your backstory, or how you got involved in this study? What event, if there was an event that said, "This is where God is calling me, and this is where I want to be."
There's absolutely a story for this, Marlon. I would never have chosen this field. I'm not courageous enough to have chosen my story or what happened to me. And I know that God has taken what wounded people meant for ill and has redeemed it for good. So I am honored and grateful to get to answer God's call for healing on my life. I'm a PK, so I assume your audience is going to know what that is. That's a preacher's kid. I grew up in a very conservative Christian denomination. My father was a really big deal in his denomination in the 50s and 60s, especially, widely known all across the country, a beloved man, a charismatic teacher and speaker, a man who deeply loved the Lord, who brought thousands and thousands and thousands of people to Christ. He was also a Christian educator and an academician at a college, now a university. Um, and so all of those things are true and things that I honor about my father. And he also was a deeply broken man. He struggled with sexual addiction all of his life, with pornography, with other forms, with inappropriate relationships with other men. So some of my earliest memories are finding my father's stashes of pornography. This would have been print pornography when I was almost a toddler, a very young child. My mother, who was obviously a preacher's wife, must have had such a hard time with knowing that this deeply beloved and again a wonderful, wonderful man also had this darker side. And when I think about how hard it is today for people to understand about sexual addiction, what does this mean? I can only imagine what it must have been like for her in the late 40s and 50s to be married to a man who had these two very different sides. Um, my mother didn't really have anyone to turn to for help in that. I think we barely today understand sexual addiction. In the 50s, we didn't understand alcoholism. And it must have been very lonely for her. And she found a surprising way out, which is called colon cancer. My mother began struggling with the symptoms of colon cancer when I was a newborn, the first year of my life. And she ignored those symptoms until they were so severe that my father became aware. And by the time she ever chose to go to the doctor, she was at stage 4 colorectal cancer. And she died when I was 3. I had some sense, this may be hard for your listeners to understand, but I knew as a tiny child, my mother was choosing to die and leave me. My spirit knew that. The body knows. The body carries the memories. The body carries the truth. The spirit carries the truth of one's existence, even if we don't have words for it or we don't understand it. I had 2 older brothers, and I wondered what kind of mom would have chosen to die and leave these 3 precious children. It wasn't until much later that I learned my mother's story. So against that backdrop, I was already a very wounded, lonely little girl. My dad had no emotional skills to help us as a family process my mother's death. We really never talked about her at all. I think it brought up so much guilt for him as well as so much grief. I do think my father deeply loved my mother. So again, I thought that maybe if I was a better little girl, that my mother would have wanted to stay alive and to be my mom. Into this situation, this void, this loneliness, again, in a otherwise very loving and deeply Christian home, um, came a perpetrator. Came a young man. I was 5 and he was 20. He came to go to the college where my father was academic dean at the time, and he came to live with our family. Um, Dozens and dozens of college guys lived with us through the years. Hundreds and hundreds more came and hung out at our house. My father had quite the gift of hospitality, a very kind-hearted, generous man. And this college guy, when I was 5, really took an interest in me. He actually became the most important figure in my childhood and adolescence, and actually in my young adulthood until I entered recovery when I was age 35. He was a dear friend and companion for my father. There was inappropriate activity was part of that relationship, but he began to let me actually talk about my mother, which was something we didn't do, and he would let me talk about my father as well, because I thought that if I were a better little girl, my daddy would want to spend time with me. And my father, whom I call Doc, he was called Doc by all the college kids, beloved figure on the college campus, um, was never ever home. Between 2 full-time jobs, both working within a Christian sphere, he was very much a workaholic, we would call it today. Poured himself out for all of those people, and again, didn't know how to nurture his family through these things. And this young man told me, "Oh, honey, that's not true. That's not your fault." It's kind of what preachers do, which unfortunately, particularly then, is accurate. Our culture is changing a little bit today, finally, I think, to help preachers honor their own first commitments in terms of human commitments to their own families. But that wasn't true for me growing up. And he said, "I'll be a father figure for you." And he was. And he taught me how to roller skate and how to ride a bicycle. And he encouraged my writing. I was already, as a 5-year-old, really interested in writing. And there's a big and there. He was also sexual with me. It frankly never occurred to me that this was sexual abuse. I mean, people didn't talk about sexual abuse in the early 1960s and the 70s and the 80s, really. And my only understanding of sexual abuse, Marlon, was that this was going to be something violent, some nasty guy who's going to snatch me by the hair of the head off of some playground and be violent with me and hurt me and terrorize me and threaten me. I never imagined that what I thought was this extremely loving relationship. This guy was present with me. He spent time with me. He nurtured me. He talked with me. He was tender with me. He told me how much he loved me. That never, ever occurred to me as sexual abuse. He began showing me pornography. He began exposing himself to me, other variety of grooming behaviors that I won't be any more graphic about than that. I was about 10 before this grooming escalated to the point that I could identify this must be something about sex. We didn't talk about sex at all in my father's home. I don't think he talked with my brothers. He certainly didn't talk with me. But just, living in the world, just watching at that point, I Love Lucy or some kind of just regular, very plain kind of TV. You just got some idea about marriages and how some of this worked. And I was not quite 16 before we had intercourse, which was my only real definition of sex. I didn't quite understand all these other escalating behaviors were a part of that process. And by that point, I was grown. I was already managing my father's household. My father never remarried. And I was his hostess for lots of functions, church functions, school functions, a lot of people that he entertained at the house. I would go with him to speak or to preach. It was the time I got to spend time with him. I was managing his household. I began managing the maid when I was 12 years old, which is way messed up. But there wasn't anyone else to fill in that void. And so I really thought that I was choosing to be sexual with this man who was 15 years older than I am, who began grooming me when I was 5. I didn't understand that. He told me he loved me, that this was a special relationship. And I believed him from the time I was 5 till I was 35. So for 30 years, until my whole life came crashing down and I entered recovery. From some of the questions that we talked about prior to this interview, I know we'll talk about what are some of the after effects, but for me, the after effects looked like two separate, completely separate, polar opposite parts of me. There was this very committed Christian, very perfectionistic, very involved in church and youth group and church summer camp and writing Christian things and all of that. And then this promiscuous side, this side of wanting to replicate what it felt like to be with this guy. And that wasn't about sex. I mean, these were sexual relationships, but that wasn't what I was after. I was after for somebody to spend time, for somebody to tell me I was special, I was valued, I was loved, I was cherished. And unfortunately, I found on this Christian college campus, beginning when I was in early high school, I started dating college guys. That's not a good plan, but there were no boundaries about that in my home, not supervision about that. I was kind of left to my own devices. I was obviously very precocious, very advanced for my years. I found there were a lot of these guys who were real willing to just kind of blow smoke at me and tell me how fabulous I was and, you know, how much they thought of me and all that if I just be sexual with them. And I was real willing to be sexual with them if they would just tell me I was okay. So looking back, probably by the time I was 17, 18 years old, I would say I was a full-blown sex, love, and relationship addict that had its roots in sexual abuse. I married, thought that would take care of my promiscuity problem, find it didn't, find that marrying couldn't take care of all the shame inside. I couldn't have called it shame, but today I know that's what that is. That he couldn't make me okay with me. I know now that's not his job, but that's what I expected somehow of marriage. I was not faithful in that marriage. We divorced after about 4 years. I very quickly remarried. David's my current husband. We've been married 38 and a half years.
Amen.
And I'm very grateful. We have 2 precious children, 3, they're grown, married. I have 3 fabulous grandchildren. I'm a grandmarmy. It's the best thing ever to be a grandmarmy. But ultimately, sexual addiction reared its head in this relationship as well, a series of stresses. And ultimately, after a long period of not acting out, but never dealing with my stuff, never dealing with my story. And again, it sounds kind of funny today, but I did really realize I had a story to deal with. I mean, of course, I was aware that my mother died, but I had just grown up that way. It's just kind of the way it was. That didn't quite seem too big of a deal, if that makes any sense. I know today it's probably the worst trauma that a young child can experience is the death of a parent, but I didn't know that then. And ultimately, I acted out in this marriage as well until what finally got my attention, which is what today I call God's severe mercy, in the words of C.S. Lewis, was cervical cancer caused by sexually transmitted disease. And that really kind of brought my life to a halt. I was very ill for about a year. I'm completely cured. It's very curable. Mine was caught early, but lots of consequences about that. And ultimately, feeling suicidal is what brought me into recovery and into the office of a marvelous Christian counselor, and into understanding first about sexual abuse and doing so much work about that, and eventually about sexual addiction. So for me, they are very much almost twins, because the vast majority of people who struggle with sexual addiction, particularly of my generation, there are a lot of 20-year-olds who've gotten pulled into this sexually saturated culture and internet pornography who aren't sexual abuse survivors. Though I would posit that our culture is sexually abusive, but we can talk about that as we continue. But just in terms of my story, these two things are very much intertwined, and I had to find healing from my trauma history, my sexual abuse, and then ultimately the work around my mother and my father, to be able to get healing around the addiction. God has been so faithful to me to redeem this extraordinary amounts of pain in my life, to call me back into to God's self, I was kind of done with God. Where was God when all these things were happening to me? I was certainly done with the church because the church didn't equip me to deal with either one of these issues. So I'm really glad and pleased to talk with you about your emphasis of within the church. How do we, within the
Yeah.
God's
Yeah.
kingdom, deal with these issues? But through the long process of recovery, came to go back to school, get a counseling degree, to work in the area of sexual abuse and sexual addiction, to start Bethesda workshops here in Nashville, and been doing this now for 25 years. So it's been a blessing and a joy, and God called me after my first counseling appointment, Marlon, the very first counseling appointment in 1991,
Wow.
and said, "You will tell this story. You will be my missionary, especially to women at first, about sexual abuse, but also about sexual addiction." And I've gotten to do that hundreds and hundreds of times. And so I'm glad now to get to do it with you on the gospel truth.
Amen, amen. That is an astounding life testimony, and I commend you because from hearing it, you know, people will be afraid to share such intimate details about that, right?
Right,
They'd be
right,
terrified,
sure,
they everything in
right,
their head is like, oh man, what is people going to think about me? Things like this, and the fact that God has given you that strength to be able to share that, because it is by our testimonies that people are able to come and see the glorious, wonderful person that Christ is, right?
right,
And by sharing these aspects and sometimes very detailed aspects, it allows people to see the minute effects those instances had on that individual. And there's no
right.
sugarcoating. There's no dancing around the subject matter. It's a
I
straightforward,
tell it
head
like it
on.
is, Marlon.
Yeah, you tell it like it is. And I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. And obviously, this is the catapult that pushed you into this area of
Yes,
ministry. And
absolutely.
this is and I have a sense of excitement behind it, because the fact that now you're reaching individuals who are also dealing with the same issues. So that is
Right.
a tremendous blessing, and I thank
It
you. I
is.
thank you for your ministry and the fact that you're obeying Christ and doing what He's called you to do. So thank you so much for that.
And you know what, Marlon? I am blessed every single day. Every time I tell this story, every time we have people come to Bethesda workshops, every time I write something, I benefit to God's glory. So, and not everyone's called to tell the story publicly like this. I've told the story on Dateline, which was, I admit, fairly scary in
Mm-hmm.
2004. So think about that, 2004, a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think all of us, Marlon, can tell the story of what God's done in our lives to somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to hear each person's story. And it may not be this dramatic and it may be different. Of course, it's different. We all have different lives. But to know and to share with somebody what my life was like, what happened, what God has done, and what life is like now is we heal relationship to relationship, person to person. That's how Jesus taught. Individual, he taught to crowds, but he taught with personal stories and parables and seeing people. And all of us can do that in
Yeah.
a probably a more private setting, but all of us can do that.
Amen. Amen. So obviously, the what happened in your life, right? It created this person, or I would like almost refer to it like an inner child. I got that from Mr. Eddie Caparucci. The inner
Sure.
child. So how has this idea of the inner child and the understanding of this inner child helped individuals? How have you helped individuals in dealing with the recovery of coming out of sexual abusive environments, or when people sexually abuse them? How has that understanding of the inner child helped that endeavor?
It has helped that a lot. It's a really important concept. For many people, that's a little bit further down the road in the healing process. But one of the biggest after effects of sexual abuse, I would also include sexual assault. So for those who maybe are older, who are date raped or who are
Mm.
stranger raped, or some of those kinds of experiences, is the creation of shame. This debilitating, I am a horrible, terrible person. Not I've done bad things, but I am basically at my core, I am flawed. I am terrible. If you knew me, you would not like me. You would not accept me. You'd go running from the room. You would judge me. You would condemn me. I am worthless. I don't have value. That kind of debilitating shame, that's what that little inner child carries. And ultimately, for her to heal, for him to heal, because men are sexual abuse, sexual trauma survivors too. It's just not nearly talked about as much with men as it is with women. But statistics show that 1 in 5, or sometimes 1 in 6 men are victims of overt sexual abuse by the time they're 18 years old. The stats for women are 1 in 3, some say 1 out of 4. So this is an enormous problem. Think about all the money we spend on cancer, you know, and it doesn't affect 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 3 people. This is a tremendous problem, but the overwhelming consequence, the overwhelming burden is shame.
Mm.
And so ultimately in this process, to help a person come to have compassion for that little wounded child, to place the blame where the blame belongs, which is on the perpetrator. It is never the fault of the victim. I would say even for teenage victims or older victims, we tend to judge them more harshly. All the media stories about uh, people who are alleging sexual abuse, and we put that victim on trial and say, well, you went to that party, you wore that outfit, you drank alcohol with these people, all of that kind of stuff. No one deserves sexual abuse. And those things, which might not be really great life choices, are not a reason to blame someone for sexual abuse or for what happened to them. So to help that victim gain compassion for herself as this vulnerable, uh, probably wounded child who's trying to get some legitimate needs met, and puts them in a vulnerable situation for some perpetrator to take advantage of. And so to help her, to help him, come alongside and just hold tenderly the heart and the spirit of that child. Sometimes we do that by my counselor had me get pictures of 5-year-old Marnie, and put that picture. I was going to see it every single day and talk to her, which felt and sounded kind of weird in the beginning, but talk to her, tell her how much Jesus loves her, how much I, as the adult, love her, how sorry I am for what happened to her. All of those things are part of that process, and are deeply important in healing.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. So, in the process of healing from sexual abuse or sexual assault, do is it what is like the typical methodology of approaching it? Because obviously you're dealing with all these emotions, and you're dealing with this anger, frustration. How do you, as a therapist, what is your initial? Because I think this is important, and I think the reason I think it's important because as church, as you look into the body of Christ, right? We look at the walls of the church, and I think the reason a lot of sexual assaults in the church they get swept under the rug sometimes. They don't get handled properly is because I don't think the church knows how to approach it. They don't know how
Right.
to deal with it. So I think this is an important question. So, in your efforts to try to break down that person in a sense, like to get to the core of the issue, what are some of the methodologies that you take to get there?
Um, there are a whole lot of things clinically that one does. I think what's most important, whether it's within the counseling realm or within the church, is to believe the victim.
Hmm.
People very, very, very rarely make this stuff up.
Right.
They just don't. Um, again, I'm aware that it happens sometimes, but the media, and I think unfortunately people in denial, have blown that way, way out of proportion. These false reports of sexual abuse. It is extremely rare. It's especially rare for an adult, as has been shown in the media, including with the Supreme Court, one of our Supreme Court justices, for an adult to come forward and say, I was assaulted. This happened to me. It happened when 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever. For the people to come forward in our churches across the country, it's happening in Protestant churches. We saw it first in a Catholic churches, and say, I was abused by this pastor, by this priest, by this youth camp, by this youth minister. As an adult, to come forward and say those things, people don't make that up. And you want to know why? Because who do we blame? Who do we put on trial? We put the victim on trial. We say, your story doesn't quite match up.
Yeah.
This is interesting to me, Marlon. Just recently, within like the last 3 months, as I was writing part of my story for another purpose, another publication, and I wrote that I was almost 16 when this perpetrator had intercourse with me. And I happened to go back and read something 15, 20 years ago that I had written. And I said I was 14. So people would look at that and go, how can we believe this woman? She doesn't even know what age she is. And you know what? That's true. And that sounds crazy, but they're parts of it's a whole neuroscience thing of how memory is stored, and particularly traumatic memory and all of this kind of stuff. There are some parts of that event that I remember so clearly, and I remember them in a 14-year-old setting. It's this house. There are other parts of that event that I remember so clearly, and remember in a 16-year-old setting, and it's this different part of that house. And when I put that together, I go, you know what? I think I was 16. I was almost 16. Was I lying before? No, I wasn't intentionally trying to lie. It's just the fluidity nature of very, very traumatic memories. We get that with a terrible car accident or some terrible house fire, and somebody says, well, I remember walking in the house and turning on the stove, but then I don't remember anything else till 2 months later. I wake up in the hospital in the burn unit, and I don't remember anything about what was I cooking or which burner did I turn on or anything like that. Or I remember seeing this car coming across the median, but I don't remember anything else about that until this later time. That's how traumatic memory works. And so my point about this very nuanced, detailed part of the story is we need to become more informed listeners as a culture, and certainly as a church, and understand that this is how memory works, and for other people to not collaborate our stories. I am certain that the night that this perpetrator entered my bedroom for that event, I am positive my father was asleep in his bedroom next door to mine. My brother, one of my brothers, one was married and out of the home, was asleep down the hall in his bedroom. They had no idea what was going on with me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. They wouldn't remember it was this particular time. And frankly, I can't tell you what even time of the year it was, though my memory is it was colder outside. They wouldn't necessarily remember that this perpetrator was in our home this particular time, because he visited with great regularity after he graduated from the college, and he had graduated by this point. So are they going to collaborate the story? Not at all those specific levels. So my takeaway, I'm belaboring this point perhaps, we need to believe people. Start from the basis of believing them, because victims get put on trial for these, quote, memory lapses, for these confusions about their story, for their own behavior that people look at and say, well, you contributed somehow to this, or for their behavior afterwards. Well, you became this alcoholic, why should we believe you? You're this, terrible person. You became this sex addict. My gracious, that's worse. You're this woman, this Christian woman who's writing about Christian things, and you're having an affair. Why in the world do we believe you? You're not even a person of integrity. We need to believe people. And that's where it starts.
Because I guess in the concern is, would you say that it's important to believe people initially, because initially, all the time initially, and then go and take the step to investigate from that perspective, or because obviously we see a lot in the culture of false rape claims. You know, people who've been accused of rape and they never did. I guess the evidence wasn't there to show that they assaulted or raped this person. People have gone to jail, you know, and then later on they get acquitted or alleviated of that case. And I think this is I think this is the scary part, because
This
one
is a
is
sticky
like,
point.
yeah, it's like one side you're like, yeah, we believe this person, and then the other side is like, well, should we believe this person? You know,
Yeah.
should we approach it from a more neutral stance and say, you know, and you know what I mean? So it's like,
Yes, I
how
do
how
know
do we
what
go
you
about
mean.
that? Mm-hmm.
It's a hard question. My bias is absolutely believe people,
Okay.
believe them from the get-go. You can do an investigation, but think about it. Is there any proof that this man sexually abused me? Absolutely not. There's no
Mm,
proof. There's my word. There's my memories. There's the after effects of my life. Would he apologized to me once and said, but I only did what you wanted me to do. Oh my
mm,
gosh. I mean, what kind
yeah.
of apology is that? I don't have that on record. I didn't record that phone call. Um, so they're very rarely, not stranger rapes, those kinds of things. Sometimes there can be found proof,
Mm-hmm.
because that's handled different typically. A
Sure.
victim is a little more likely to go to the hospital and those kinds of things. But the vast majority, stranger rape is actually extraordinarily rare when you think about the whole problem of sexual abuse and sexual assault. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are abused by someone they know and
Mm,
someone they trust. There's not going to be collaboration of that. There's not going to be proof. Not years and years and years and years later. Very occasionally with children, if it's caught right now, sometimes there might be some kind of proof, but most of the time we're talking about years later.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I work primarily with adult victims of childhood sexual abuse. I'm not trained specifically in working with children. There are nuances about that, but again, I believe that we should start with believing people. Um,
Okay.
and the idea of false accusations, um, I hope this is okay to say this, but in my judgment as a very privileged white woman, is that those false accusations are often racially driven.
Mm,
That 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 we are seeing, sadly, in our U.S. culture at
mm-hmm.
least, still so much racism, so much fear about
Mm-hmm.
that, and um, just statistically, disproportionately, that's what I see.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm grateful that at least we have DNA and we have a lot better technology that we're keeping, I hope, more innocent people from going to prison and spending 40 years there before now finally some DNA that gets tested finally is exonerating them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're doing a little bit better job about that than we did, up until 5 or 10 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say within the church, certainly, and part of it again is the idea of it's just so hard to admit that this person that may be this fine upstanding church member or church leader, and patriarchy goes into this too a lot,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, which is another bias of mine, a controversial topic within Christian circles. um, to how do we, would Brother Joe really do this?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, probably that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Would Reverend Tom really hurt this child or this teenager? It's possible. So we're just so much in denial for a lot of reasons about this that has made, frankly, our churches often, even I think more than our culture, not safe places for victims to bring their story.
And that's concerning because the church is supposed to be a safe place, right? The church is supposed to
It is.
be the the church is supposed to be the place like, man, if you have a problem, let's take it to the Lord, let's pray about it, let's do the whole thing, fasting and so forth. And it's not it's a safe place, but sometimes it can be very, very difficult to get beyond the the structure of it, the government, the church government in a sense, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And there's a bit of frustration there. And so, you brought up a good point about would Pastor Joe or Elder Joe, would he really do this?
Right.
And I think the big thing within the church is that the reason sexual assault is not handled in some cases, I ain't gonna say many. There's a bunch of church out there that do handle it correctly.
I
And some
disagree with you.
you
Not in my
you just
experience.
not the
I
experience. Okay,
absolutely
okay,
disagree with you. This is
okay,
routinely handled terribly,
okay,
terribly.
okay, okay.
Maybe you know some better church leaders than
Yeah,
in
I
my
know.
field I
Yeah,
experience.
I know of a story, that
Please.
a woman was sexually assaulted, and the pastor, from my perspective, what I read about it and stuff like that, he handled it in a manner that was appropriate. You know what I mean?
Good for him.
And it was handled correctly. And like I was saying about the pastors, like sometimes it's like, no, not this person, no way, not
I
this
know.
person,
I
and the
know.
embarrassment of the church as this church may have a hundred, 200, 300, 400 members, and no, we can't bring that kind of shame on the church. No, we can't do it.
That's
You
exactly right.
know,
And see,
yeah.
that was part of my father's story. This deeply beloved, charismatic pastor who was a sex addict and who, with his inappropriate relationships, brought perpetrators into our home. I
Hmm,
mean, this man was one of my father's companions.
hmm, and yeah,
You know, how
yeah,
would you believe that? Now, that story,
yeah.
my father crashed and burned. That became public um,
Hmm,
eventually in the mid 1980s, and he had to resign and disgrace from the church and from the college. Um, but there were finally enough young men on the college campus who were saying, yes, this happened to me. He groomed me. He was sexual with me.
hmm,
And I'm not going to be silent about it anymore. But it took person after person after person because there had been rumors for so long. But Pastor Billy Bob was just so beloved and so wonderful. And both things are true. I
hmm,
think, Marlon, sometimes we don't give enough credit to the complexity of the human condition.
hmm. Okay.
That we fail to realize all of us are deeply, deeply broken people. It's what happened in the fall.
Yeah.
Uh, all of us are wounded in some way. All of us have unhealthy coping in some way. Some of it is socially acceptable, like workaholism, or maybe we're a little bit getting out there, like alcoholism or different things. Some of it is heinous, but all of us have fallen short of the glory of God. It's
Yeah.
it's where we are, and to understand that people are extraordinarily complex. God made us that way, but that it's possible for really good seeming people who did and are doing a lot of good. My father did enormous amounts of good to further the kingdom of God and to genuinely help people. I believe with all my heart he deeply loved God and wanted to serve him and wanted to be a better man. And he never got help for any of his issues. And so he was ill equipped to live into the fullness of Christ that God had called him to do. And and that's the case for all of us at different degrees. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. Makes total sense. So, what is some of the collateral damage that comes from the area of sexual abuse? Like, you got your anger, you have your anger, you have your different emotions. But what are some of the, I guess, the more traumatic areas of outcomes of sexual abuse? Just to sort of, because the reason I ask this question is because, once again, it's another indicator, it's another indication
Right.
that people don't know, and I think, once
Right.
again, I emphasize the church, we need to be able to pinpoint these indications and say, okay,
Right.
this person, I'm not going to go out my way and say that he or she has, but there's a strong possibility that it could have happened. So let me sit down with this person and see if they're okay. You know what I mean?
Right.
And perhaps
Right.
that's all that person needs is somebody to take them, sit them down, you know, and say, "Hey, man, I noticed you been acting like this, and is everything okay?" You know, and you know, so what would be some of the
Yeah.
traumatic signals if you can point them out?
Yeah. There's a long list of clinically research validated after effects that are typical for sexual trauma survivors. Some of them we would put in the mental health category. Excuse me, like depression, like anxiety. Certainly not everybody that's depressed or everybody who has anxiety has been sexually abused. And many, many sexual trauma survivors do struggle with those kinds of things. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We came to understand that from our vets who were coming back, initially coming back from Vietnam. But this is a huge clinical phenomenon that, I mean, I was having panic attacks. I would pass somebody in the grocery store and here's this whiff of cologne coming off a guy and just kind of crumple and anxiety and what's happening to me. And came to understand eventually that smell was the cologne that this perpetrator wore. That's what I'm talking about PTSD kind of symptoms. Abusing alcohol and drugs is part of this picture as well. Excuse me. There have been lots of statistics shown about treatment failures for alcohol and drug treatment in women, especially. Multiple treatment failures. This person who goes to treatment, maybe a great treatment center, they're there 30 days and they come out and they relapse and they go back. And these multiple times, what is the common denominator of these people? Untreated sexual trauma. So all of this pain has got to go somewhere. And alcohol and drugs are a great way, short term, to tap down, to minimize, to soothe, to medicate this kind of pain. Always looking something like that. Sexual acting out. Again, it's not necessarily, we can't say it's a cause and effect, but there's a huge statistical correlation. So when individuals are living lives of promiscuity or having affairs or visiting strip clubs or paying for sex in other ways, certainly at that level, we need to look at and think, I wonder what might be driving this behavior. This is not just standing in judgment. You're a horrible, terrible person. Do you not love God? Don't you know these things are outside of God's bounds for healthy sexuality, which they are. But to wonder, to come with that spirit of compassion, to come with that spirit of how can we be of help rather than of judgment for you. Those are some of the after effects. Really volatile relationships, whether they're multiple serious, significant relationships like marriages or just this pattern of going from person to person to person. You know, we need to be careful and not just automatically assume, well, this must be somebody that's been sexually abused. But you're exactly right. It's worth very gently creating a safe enough space where someone could tell their story. Again, I didn't know I was sexually abused, but when I told my story first to a good friend around the suicidal episode, and then to a counselor, they both could put the pieces of this story together and go, boom. I mean, this is easy to see from a distance. You're 5 years old and this guy's, 20, or you're 16 and he's whatever 16 plus 15 is, 31. This is sexual abuse. But I would never have told, well, I was sexually abused. I wouldn't have told that. If somebody asked me that, I would have said, no. So those are some of the things that could at least be warning signs. Eating disorders, food addiction, whether it's binging, whether or not somebody's purging, or whether it's withholding food, the anorexic side. There's a huge statistical correlation between sexual abuse and later addictive behavior, especially sexual addiction and food eating disorders. So to just be aware of those kinds of things, and at least come at them with a little bit different lens.
Okay. Would you say homosexuality or lesbianism is also a I guess, a collateral way of expressing the sexual abuse that they went through, if that makes sense.
Um,
would you say that's a huge indication as well?
no, not necessarily.
Okay.
Does it happen sometimes? Yes. Sometimes people are, it's called trauma repetition. They're
Okay.
repeating the trauma. You're abused by a same sex person. I'm going to act out with that same sex person, kind of as a way to kind of, at least now this time I'm in control. It feels like I'm doing this out of my choice.
Okay.
So there is some of that, but that's another whole different kind of issue as well.
Okay. Okay. Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Is it what would be, I guess, okay, so as a parent, I have three girls. I have three girls. I have a
Uh,
21 year old, about to be a 6 year old, a 3 year old, and I have one son who just turned 1 years old. So 1 year old.
oh
So,
my.
yeah, so my arrows are loaded, right? I have a whole bunch of arrows there. So as a parent, like we've taught our daughter, if anyone if anyone ever approaches you, to do something to you like that, we want you to, scream, get out of there, just do what you do. If we're not there, scream, do whatever you can, say, don't touch me, the whole nine, and if I guess from a parent perspective, how do we approach that as a parent? You know what I mean? As a parent to
Yeah.
say, because I think one thing that parents deal with, and I think because I don't think I shared this with you, but I was molested as a child, right?
Mm,
So, and I think one of the things that my mom dealt with was the shame that came along with the embarrassment,
right.
not my child, right? This did not happen
Right.
to my child.
Right.
Even to this day, my mom does not like to talk about it, and understandably
Yeah.
so. You know what I mean? It's a hard thing for her to gather, a hard thing for her to process. But I use it as a testimony personally. You know what I mean? And but it's still hard for her. So as a parent, how do we as parents approach the situation from a father and mother perspective to say, I'm going to help my child get through this sexual abuse? What are some pointers that you can give us in that area?
Yeah. I think it's a great question to be thinking about prevention as much. And with no disrespect to your mom, she was, doing the best she could and the woman of her
Mm-hmm.
generation. Um, we do things completely differently. We start by teaching children healthy sexuality. We start
Okay.
that with your little 1 year old when,
Yeah.
when you're um, bathing him. Is that the one that's a little boy?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that you don't skip from his shoulders to his knees as you're saying, well, going to wash your arm and I'm going to wash your belly. I mean, you teach them their body parts. You create an environment where it is okay to talk about sexual things, where you're answering questions honestly, age appropriate things. You're certainly doing what you described, teaching about good touch and not good touch, giving children autonomy over their body. What I mean by that, um, a 4 year old gets to decide, I don't want, Sister Jones to hug me like that at church. It just
Right.
feels icky.
Right.
Now, there may be not one thing the matter with how Sister Jones hugs the child, other than she has too much perfume and kind of blue hair, and she's engulfing the child, and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
kid's just like, So I'm not saying, Sister, that there is anything inappropriate, but the child gets to decide.
Yeah.
I just, Sister Jones, can I pat your hand? And y'all as parents need to help foster that. She's at a shy stage, so she doesn't like being hugged. So if you would just, pat her little arm or something. I mean, you're helping. That's what I mean by teaching children autonomy about their body, that that they have a right to their bodies and to decide what happens to them. Obviously, you know, it's a little bit different with parents and it's different with doctors, but teaching them all those kinds of things, teaching them always to tell. There's some good books out now just around safety around the internet, good pictures,
Mm-hmm.
bad pictures,
Mm-hmm.
just teaching them those kinds of things in today's society. And then if, heaven forbid, a parent discovers that unfortunately, sadly, this child has been molested, has been abused in some way, a babysitter at daycare, wherever this, at a friend's house, by an older sibling, by a parent, whatever the situation is, um, to immediately lean in with love and compassion and calm to the child. I'm so sorry that happened to you. This was not your fault. It was wrong for so and so to do that to you. I'm here for you. We'll help you. We will protect you. You won't ever go back to play at that house again, or to again be able to calmly talk about these things and to put into place the right boundaries that child needs for protection. And unless it's a child to child thing, which might be more um, not necessarily the healthiest thing, but more normal, age appropriate kind of exploration that little kids will do, um, to always be aware there may be a reporting thing about that you as a parent um, have an absolute obligation to report that this 13-year-old baby has molested your 6-year-old child.
Hmm.
That that's something that needs to happen. Um, so so doing all of those kinds of things, and again, repeatedly helping the child understand you did not do anything wrong, and
Yeah.
someone else made a very bad choice, and
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get help about this,
Yeah.
or things that could.
Yeah, I know. Once again, in my household, we don't allow our kids to do sleepovers. We don't allow it.
They're
Um,
super young.
yeah, and we're me and my wife, we're like, nope, nope, nope. We're super protective in that regard. Would you say that would you say that should be a realm where the church should consider, approaching, as far as the area of, like, I guess, sleepovers, things, just a curriculum of teaching parents the yeses and the nos of
Sure.
where they're able to approach this area.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. And I think, generally speaking, maybe because insurance companies are requiring this, more churches are doing a good job about setting up parameters, um, particularly around church activities. Like, for example, it is not a good plan for the youth pastor to be driving one kid home. Doesn't matter
Okay.
if it's same sex, opposite sex. One adult should never be in a private space with one kid. I mean,
Okay.
that's true in the church nursery. That's true at the picnic. That's true at church camp. That's true with these kinds of things, to just set up those kinds of boundaries,
Okay.
of this is healthy, appropriate behavior, to teach parents, long term, it will be good for your children to have friends over and for them to go to other people's houses and to have sleepovers and all that. They're
Mm-hmm.
very young right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to teach parents, you don't just let Johnny go to the Smith's house. You have a conversation with mom or dad Smith, and you talk about, are you going to be home all evening? What are y'all going to be doing? What
Mm-hmm.
are your rules around TV or around internet or around social media? Are there any guns in your home? If
Yeah.
so, how are they secured? Just, you know, will there be other adults in your home? Just just all of these questions, and to not be afraid to offend the Smiths because you're
Yeah.
asking these questions. These are just reasonable things that in our culture today one wants to know before you're entrusting your kid into the care of other parents or other adults.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting, interesting. Yeah, it's because it's a hard part for me, man. It's really difficult for me. I am, like, really protective of them, but at the same
I
time,
hear you.
I don't want to be too protective where I'm sort of keeping them in this cave, if you will. You know what I mean? I want them to be able
Right.
to experience things, right? So it's interesting as a parent, when
It
you
is,
get hit with that question,
of
as a
course.
parent, am I protecting my kid from such possibilities of being sexually assaulted?
Right.
And as a believer, man, not even as a believer, just a believer in culture in
A
general,
concerned parent.
you should
Yeah,
be a concerned parent and approach that in a proper manner, and be aggressive. Like you said, don't be afraid to offend. Be aggressive in your questioning just to secure that safety and security that you want your children to
exactly.
have. You know,
And expect and welcome when other parents are asking you those kinds of things.
sure,
Well,
sure, yeah.
here's here are the rules in our home, and blah 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 blah, and all of those kinds of things to just set up the culture. That's what's expected.
So, Marnie, what would you say to someone who is afraid? Someone who's afraid to come out and say, This has happened to me."
Happened to me.
What would be your word of encouragement to anybody out there that is dealing with that inner struggle?
Yeah. Um, I would honor that fear and affirm it, and I would promise them that long term the truth will set you free. God knew what God was doing with those kinds of proclamations, and um, to keep the secret keeps someone in bondage. It keeps the shame all inside, all surrounding you, all suffocating you. And to be able to release that secret and get the help that you need. Again, the challenge comes back the way we've talked earlier is that the person to whom you share the truth really matters. So to help understand who are safe people, who are people who will receive this truth with love and tenderness and compassion and offering help and not judgment or condemnation or heaping more shame upon the person. And again, that's an education thing within our churches and within our culture about that. But I would so want um, people to know that there is healing that is possible. I can tell you, Marla, today, God has redeemed my pain in so many incredible ways. Can I tell you just one of them
You sure
that
can. You sure
impacts
can.
what we're talking about? This perpetrator, I know now he was a perpetrator. I thought he was this dear family friend. He had a PhD in theater.
Mm.
He came to the college for that. He went on to get a doctorate in theater. And he is who got me interested in theater. I did lots of theater as a kid, high school student, some extent as a college student. This man is who taught me how to speak, how to have presence. Now, I get that you're kind of somewhat born with that. There are people for whom or even just doing this kind of interview would just freak them out. I'm a preacher's kid. I grew up hearing this marvelous speaker all the time, and it's in my genes.
Yeah.
And this man, so there's that part, but this man honed that and taught me how to do that and fostered my writing. And today, Marlon, every single day, including right this second, I use speaking and presence and writing to God's glory for healing. That's redemption.
Amen.
And that would never, I would not have made those connections or be here in this place without telling this truth, even when I didn't understand the story. And God brought into my life safe people. And then seeing how it's played out of the last 25, 27 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, it reminds me of Genesis chapter 50, where it
Absolutely.
said, what you meant for bad, God meant it for good.
God has intended for
And
good. That's
yeah, and
exactly
it's
right.
it's incredible that God can take something that has this stain on it, if you will,
That's right.
and use that for His glory, for His honor.
That's right.
That's absolutely wonderful and amazing. And thank you for coming on here, Marnie, and just giving us a rundown on this huge area, this problematic area, that the
Right.
churches certainly do need to improve on. And so, with all the questions that I threw at you, sexual abuse, how to overcome sexual issues, and things like that, the symptoms of sexual assault, I have one more question for you. And that
What's that?
is, what is the gospel truth?
Oh, the gospel truth is what I mentioned a few minutes ago. The truth will set you free. That God is a loving God who always longs for our healing from living in this fallen world, who always wants relationship with us, who's always pursuing us, even when we're not sure about God or we don't want to be pursuing God. And maybe we don't even want to be pursued by God. But God is constant in his pursuit of us, his love for us, his heart of redemption. And healing happens by the power of God's truth.
Amen, amen. And that is the gospel truth. You know, I love it. I love it because I'm able to get folks on here and they're able to just really give us a good, thorough rundown of the subject matter. And Marnie, you have not disappointed. You have not disappointed. And I'm
Thank you.
so thankful for your graciousness. I'm so thankful for your time because I know you're very busy. And you're about to have a conference this weekend, right? For young
We
adults or
are
young teens, right?
actually teenagers, yes, for teen males who are struggling with problematic sexual behavior, pornography primarily,
Mm.
who are coming to a weekend with their parents. And guess who doesn't really want to come?
The
The parents.
fathers, the parents.
They
Wow,
they would
wow.
rather just send my kid. Would you fix my kid? But that's not the model of true healing. So
Mm.
I'm excited and appreciate the courage of these families who are coming from different parts of the country to be with us to have healthy conversations around sexuality and healing in this area.
So where could people find your content, or even if they
Oh,
decide
thank
they if they decide they want to do this teenage conference in the future, you know, because at least you said this is your
yeah.
first annual one, right? So if they decide to do it in the future, where could they find your content for that?
Yeah, we've actually had several, but
Okay.
frankly, we've canceled more than we've had because it's just a hard thing for parents to lean into. We have a really comprehensive website, so that's the best place for people to find out about Bethesda workshops. And our website is just BethesdaWorkshops.org. So Bethesda, like Bethesda, Maryland, BETHESDA, workshops, plural with an S, .org, O-R-G. Lots of information about us, about the programs we have, focused on sexual addiction. But here at the workshops, we deal with sexual trauma because that's a part of the picture. So lots of free information there, even if somebody is not interested in particularly coming to one of our clinical intensive 4-day workshops. But just that they can read a pretty extensive recommended reading list broken down by category. So there's some great books about sexual abuse that might be helpful to people that could be found there. BethesdaWorkshops.org.
All right, all right. So everyone, check it out. If you are
Thank you.
inclined, if you're motivated by this interview, check it out. Check it out. So good stuff, Marnie. I appreciate you once again. I'm gonna close this
Thank
thing
you.
out. May God bless you and may God keep you.
Thank you. And you as well, Marlon. Thank you.
All right, all right. All right, folks. Another installment of the Gospel Truth is in the books, and I just want to encourage everyone out there that how vitally important it is for those who have been sexually abused to come forward. There are many outreaches that you can reach out to. There are many areas of many individuals, hopefully within your church, that you can sit down and talk to about anything that has happened to you. And as Marnie said, it is a place of healing, a place of being alleviated from the guilt, being alleviated from the pain, the anger, the frustration of it. And so it's not good to keep this stuff in. If you've ever been sexually assaulted, if anything has ever happened to you in that nature, please reach out. You can reach out to me, you know, and I can connect you to someone who could probably help you if I can. You know, just reach out, get it out, because it's important for your safety, for your health, and for your relationship with Christ. And it's important that those who've done these tragedies be brought to justice and be brought into a place of healing as well. We can't forget them because they too are hurting, and hurt people. And it's important to help them as well. So with that said, I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. And I pray that this episode will be a blessing to you. May God bless you and may God keep you. Go on.